The charge was unthinkable. Emperor Caligula turned his palace into a brothel and forced Rome's most powerful women to work in it. Senators' wives and daughters were lined up, priced, and ordered to serve strangers inside the imperial chambers, while officials recorded every coin as state income. It wasn't rumor. It was written in Rome's own histories. Why would the richest man on earth do something so obscene? Was it lust or a weapon? If you value the record, subscribe. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. According to Suetonius and Cassius Dio, the transformation was shockingly deliberate. Caligula, barely in his 20s, heir to the most powerful empire on earth, announced that the Palatine Palace would open a new institution. One wing was remodeled: velvet couches, perfumed lamps, attendants to collect fees. Messengers were sent into the forum to summon Rome's men, rich or poor, citizen or freedman, to come and enjoy what the emperor himself called the pleasures of the state. But the women weren't courtesans. They were the wives, sisters, and daughters of senators, the same men who had once ruled the Republic. Caligula's guards dragged them into the palace, assigned them rooms, and fixed their prices. One scribe wrote down the names, another tallied the payments, and all revenue went directly into the imperial treasury. Every transaction was documented as if it were tax collection. The sources describe Caligula walking among the rooms, not as participant, but as inspector. He would pause, observe, and sometimes offer corrections, mocking the men who watched helplessly. In one grotesque account, he allegedly placed a scale at the entrance so that guests would weigh their coins before entering, turning the act of desire into a ritual of humiliation. To the Senate, this was madness beyond comprehension. But beneath the obscenity was a clear logic. Caligula wasn't trying to profit, he was trying to punish. The empire's richest man had no need for such revenue. What he wanted was control. The Roman elite measured their worth by dignitas, honor, family reputation, the chastity of their women. By forcing their wives and daughters into service, Caligula attacked that very foundation. It was psychological warfare disguised as pleasure. Each night's business was a public execution of status. The women's bodies became ledgers of political obedience. Each touch, each coin, a symbol of submission. Ancient writers painted him as a monster, but the more one studies the evidence, the more terrifying the pattern becomes. Caligula wasn't insane, he was methodical. He turned sex into a state instrument, shame into law, and pleasure into proof of loyalty. The brothel was never about lust. It was a message. Your power, your pride, even your purity belong to me. Behind the silk curtains and laughter, Rome's ruling class was being dismantled one humiliation at a time. What looked like sin was, in truth, strategy. And for the men who entered those halls, there was no escape. Because in Caligula's Rome, even virtue had a price. The ancient historians claimed Caligula opened his brothel for money. They said he was bankrupt from his excesses, his games, his palaces, his fleets of golden ships, and that the imperial treasury was empty. The solution, Suetonius sneered, was to prostitute the palace itself. It's a story that sounds convenient. The mad emperor, drowning in debts, selling sex to refill his coffers. But the numbers don't add up. The emperor of Rome didn't need a brothel to make money. He owned the world's mines, taxed Egypt's grain, and controlled the ports of every major province. The entire Mediterranean economy flowed into his treasury. Whatever income the palace brothel produced would have been meaningless, a single coin in an ocean of gold. And Caligula, the man who built floating palaces with marble floors, hardly cared for petty revenue. So if profit wasn't the motive, what was? The answer lies in Rome's invisible currency, dignitas, a man's honor, his moral weight, his standing in the eyes of others. It could not be bought or sold, but it governed everything. The Senate existed to protect it. A nobleman could lose his fortune and still be respected, but lose his dignitas, and he was nothing. That was the weapon Caligula reached for. He didn't invent cruelty. He perfected humiliation. By ordering the wives and daughters of senators to serve in his palace, he attacked the very foundation of Rome's social hierarchy. These women were not victims chosen at random. They were symbols of their husband's authority. In Roman culture, a man's public image was inseparable from the purity of his household. His wife represented his moral virtue, his daughter, his lineage, his home, his sacred domain. To defile them was to dismantle his power. Caligula understood this better than anyone. When he summoned the senators' wives to his chambers, he wasn't chasing pleasure. He was staging a ritual. Every time one of those women was forced to stand behind the silk curtains of the palace, every time a man placed money on the table to claim her, the emperor wasn't enriching himself. He was recording a debt of shame. The transactions were theatrical. Officials taking names, scribes writing ledgers, guards ensuring order. Everything bore the appearance of legality. That's what made it terrifying. It wasn't chaos, it was procedure. Lust had been turned into law. Imagine the effect. The most powerful men in Rome, whose ancestors had conquered the known world, now saw their honor sold like grain. They could not protest without confessing. They could not resist without risking execution. Caligula had found a punishment that left no martyrs, only broken men. Ancient witnesses describe him walking among the rooms with calm detachment, offering casual remarks as if inspecting merchandise. "Does she please you?" he might ask. "Her father voted against my decree." It was bureaucratic vengeance disguised as decadence, and the symbolism went deeper. The Palatine Hill, the site of the brothel, was not just any location. It was the spiritual center of imperial Rome, home to the temples of Apollo and the great palaces of Augustus. To desecrate that space with commerce of flesh was an act of total inversion. Caligula wasn't hiding his blasphemy, he was declaring it as policy. He was rewriting the sacred geography of power. The Senate had once been Rome's conscience, the guardian of tradition. By forcing their families into this degradation, Caligula turned them into complicit spectators. They became actors in his theater of subjugation. It was the same method he would later use in his dinner parties, his mock marriages, and even his public games. Spectacles engineered to blur the line between loyalty and surrender. But beneath the cruelty lay a psychological calculus. Caligula had grown up watching the Senate destroy his family. His father Germanicus, Rome's beloved general, was likely poisoned by imperial order. His mother and brothers were starved to death in exile. The same senators who now whispered about his madness had once applauded those purges. When Caligula inherited power, he inherited a theater of hypocrisy. The brothel was his revenge, a reversal of shame. Where the Senate once judged emperors, now the emperor judged their morality in the most personal way possible. Some historians argue that this was Caligula's message to the old republic, that the republic was dead, and its guardians were now his servants. But there's another interpretation, one even darker. The palace brothel was a laboratory of control. It taught Rome a new language of power, that fear alone wasn't enough. You needed complicity. You had to make your subjects participate in their own degradation. That is why the system was so effective. It didn't just terrify, it corrupted. A senator who knew his wife had been used by imperial decree could never again oppose the emperor without exposing himself. Shame became a leash stronger than any sword. And yet, beneath all the humiliation, there was also performance. Caligula understood the Roman appetite for spectacle, the same culture that filled amphitheaters to watch men die. The brothel was his mirror to the people. You call me depraved, yet you pay to watch suffering. The hypocrisy of Rome was his script. He merely played it louder. In the end, the so-called sexual rituals of Caligula weren't orgies at all. They were ceremonies of power. Each act was a reenactment of Rome's own corruption. Senators selling loyalty, priests selling sanctity, citizens selling silence. The emperor simply made the transaction visible. The ledgers, if they ever existed, are lost. But the metaphor endures. Caligula understood that the body could be weaponized more effectively than the sword, and humiliation, once recorded, never truly fades. When he walked through those candlelit halls, surrounded by trembling aristocrats and perfumed air, he wasn't a madman in ecstasy. He was an accountant of obedience, tallying Rome's submission one body at a time. The question remains, if this was all theatre, who was the audience? The people? The gods? Or Caligula himself, testing how far power could push before the world broke? In the next part, we'll see how that same obsession with domination extended beyond flesh, to blood. Because when Caligula turned to his own family, the line between ritual and religion vanished completely. The brothel was only the beginning. What began as humiliation by design soon evolved into a campaign of psychological warfare against Rome's ruling class. Caligula had found a weapon far deadlier than the sword, ritualized shame, and he wielded it with precision. To understand this war, we must remember who his enemies were. The Roman Senate was ancient, proud, and obsessed with its own dignity. It was the last remnant of the Republic, the institution that had once murdered Julius Caesar for calling himself a god. Caligula, barely out of his youth, knew that he could never share power with men who believed their names were sacred. So, he set out to destroy not their bodies, but their mythology. The palace brothel was only Act 1. Act 2 was the theatre of public humiliation. At banquets, Caligula would invite senators and their wives, seating them according to whim, placing old rivals side by side, forcing enemies to toast one another. During the feast, he would abruptly rise, summon a senator's wife to his couch, and lead her away while her husband sat frozen. The room would fall silent. Moments later, Caligula would return, pour himself wine, and begin describing, in detail, what had just happened in the next room. She was shy at first, he would say, but learned quickly. Laughter followed, but no one dared respond. It wasn't entertainment, it was domination. The Roman household was sacred. The patria potestas, a father's absolute authority over his family, was the foundation of law, morality, and politics. When Caligula violated that sanctity in public, he was performing an act of legal inversion. The Senate ruled the empire through law. Caligula ruled the Senate through its violation. Each time he mocked a man's wife, he rewrote the constitution in bloodless gestures. This ritual of degradation extended into politics itself. He began appointing unqualified men to high office simply to mock the Senate's pretensions. When the senators protested, he would smile and ask, "Shall I appoint your horse instead?" The threat became legend. His beloved stallion, Incitatus, was given marble stables, golden oats, and servants dressed like magistrates. Caligula promised to make the animal consul. The Senate gasped. The emperor laughed. The gesture wasn't madness, it was symbolism. By offering a horse the highest title in Rome, Caligula declared that the Senate's dignity meant nothing. If he could turn noble women into prostitutes, he could just as easily turn a horse into a statesman. It was the same message, restated in political theatre. Your power exists because I permit it. But humiliation alone was not enough. It had to be institutionalized. Caligula began issuing decrees that blurred the line between law and spectacle. He reinstated treason trials, reviving the instruments of fear used by his predecessor Tiberius, but twisted them into public rituals. Senators accused of insulting the emperor's divinity were summoned before the court, forced to read their own sentences aloud, and then ordered to attend banquets as if nothing had happened. One senator, unable to endure the shame, slit his wrists in his bath. Caligula's reaction, according to Dio, was chilling. Too late. He should have died when I told him to. The emperor had mastered a new form of tyranny, execution by reputation. Rome had always valued glory above life. Caligula understood that to destroy a man in Rome, you didn't need to kill him. You only needed to make him laugh at his own degradation. This strategy reached its peak during the Games of Jupiter in 39 CE. Caligula ordered senators to appear on stage, dressed as gladiators, to reenact myths of betrayal and divine punishment. When one elder stumbled in his armor, Caligula shouted from his seat, "Fall like the Republic did." The crowd roared, the senators trembled. What had once been ritual reverence had become mockery. The line between theatre and law was gone. Yet, beneath the laughter was terror. Every man in that audience knew that his own humiliation could be next. For the Roman people, these spectacles blurred judgment. Was Caligula mad? Or was he revealing the hypocrisy of their world? The same crowd that condemned his obscenities still filled the amphitheaters to cheer on executions. The Senate that cried for justice once applauded when Tiberius starved Caligula's family to death. Perhaps Caligula wasn't inventing evil. He was simply showing Rome its reflection. Still, the emperor's cruelty was not random. It followed a system, the logic of control through desecration. By fusing religion, sex, and politics into one theatre, he made himself the sole actor capable of crossing every boundary. He was priest, pimp, and judge all at once. His subjects could only watch, and for a time, it worked. The Senate, broken and terrified, passed decrees praising his divine insight. They built statues in his honor, called him Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. What had begun as blasphemy became official policy. But the system that Caligula built carried its own poison. The more absolute his control, the more isolated he became. The laughter he demanded turned to whispers behind his back. Even his guards began to fear him. A few senators began to plot, quietly, waiting for the day when the humiliation would end. they wouldn't have to wait long. Because Caligula's next act would go even further, beyond politics, beyond shame, into something Rome had never dared imagine: the unholy union of blood and divinity. The war against the Senate was nearly complete. The next war would be against the gods themselves. In 38 CE, the whispers changed direction. For once, they weren't about senators' wives or palace brothels, but about the emperor's sister, Julia Drusilla. She was young, beautiful, and, according to every ancient account, the only person Caligula ever truly loved. The gossip began with glances, then gestures, then dinners where the two sat together as if husband and wife. Soon, the rumor became accusation. Caligula was sleeping with his sister. Rome, a city built on the myth of divine ancestry, had finally found a scandal that seemed to defy even its own gods. The historians tell the story with venom. Suetonius wrote that Caligula lived with Drusilla as his wife, flaunting their intimacy at banquets, calling her my other self. Dio claimed he took her from her husband, a nobleman of the Senate, and paraded her through the streets as if she were an empress. To Rome, this wasn't just indecency, it was sacrilege. Incest wasn't merely immoral, it violated the cosmic order. And then, in the summer of that same year, Drusilla died, suddenly, perhaps from fever. What followed was something the empire had never seen before. Caligula shut down the state, literally. Courts, markets, and temples were closed. Laughter was banned. Anyone caught smiling, eating with family, or attending public games could be executed. Rome became a city of mourning for one woman. But the mourning wasn't grief, it was command. Days later, Caligula issued a decree that froze the Senate in disbelief. Drusilla was to be declared a goddess. Her name, Diva. Drusilla Panthea, the all-goddess. Priests were appointed, temples ordered, sacrifices prescribed. Her image appeared on coins beside his own, her name invoked in oaths before the emperor. Caligula didn't just mourn his sister, he deified her. To the senators, it was proof of madness. To Caligula, it was logic. Because this wasn't about grief, it was about hierarchy. In Rome, gods and men were separated by law and ritual. By elevating Drusilla to godhood, Caligula was doing something more radical than blasphemy. He was importing an Eastern idea of power. In the kingdoms of Egypt and the Hellenistic world, rulers claimed divine bloodlines. Pharaohs married their sisters not out of lust, but to preserve divine purity. To them, incest wasn't perversion, it was theology. The divine family had to remain unmixed. And Caligula, who grew up studying those traditions, saw in them a blueprint for absolute rule. By marrying his sister, by elevating her above mortals, he was rewriting the Roman concept of divinity. No longer would gods be distant or ancestral. He, the emperor, could create them. And if he could create them, he could become one himself. The deification of Drusilla was the first step toward that transformation. It made Caligula not only emperor, but divine sibling, a god by association. The Senate's outrage only confirmed his success. To oppose her divinity was to commit heresy. To question his love was to question the gods. He had placed himself beyond judgment. Behind this theology of incest lay the same logic as the brothel: power through desecration. Where he once sold noble women's bodies to strip their husbands of pride, he now sanctified his sister's body to strip Rome of its moral boundaries. In both cases, the sacred was inverted. The family became theatre. The divine became property. Archaeological traces of this shift still exist. A bronze inscription found near Antium refers to Drusilla as the new Venus. Her cult statues depict her holding a dove and a scepter, the attributes of divine sovereignty. And on one surviving coin, Caligula's face looks not forward, but upward, as if already ascending. To later generations, this act became the ultimate symbol of his insanity. But to Caligula, it was symmetry. He had humiliated the Senate by violating their women. Now he would elevate himself by sanctifying his own. What began as the politics of shame had evolved into the theology of control. His enemies couldn't comprehend it because it wasn't meant for them. It was a message to the world. The emperor does not serve the gods, he makes them. When Drusilla's temples were completed, Caligula ordered sacrifices performed in her honor, demanding that her name be spoken alongside Jupiter's. Those who hesitated were noted. Those who laughed disappeared. The Senate, once the guardian of Roman virtue, was now forced to worship the proof of its own impotence. In the space of a year, Caligula had turned the two most sacred symbols of Roman order, the household and the heavens, into extensions of his will. He had commodified sex, politicized purity, and rewritten godhood as a family affair. Rome could no longer tell the difference between religion and obedience. And yet, even this blasphemous brilliance would not be enough. Because in Caligula's mind, there was one final frontier left to conquer. Not the body, not the gods, but perception itself. If he could make men worship him in fear, he wanted to see if he could make them laugh while doing it. That experiment would come next. Banquets where wives became prizes, senators became performers, and the emperor turned humiliation into art. To Rome, incest was unspeakable. To Caligula, it was law. After Drusilla's death, the emperor didn't hide his obsession. He codified it. His public mourning was not weakness, it was legislation. The deification of his sister wasn't just grief transformed into ritual. It was the legalization of blasphemy, and through it, the consolidation of power. Historians have long tried to interpret this act as madness. But madness doesn't create new theology. It doesn't write decrees or rewrite the social contract. Caligula's actions followed a brutal, coherent logic. By merging his private life with divine authority, he obliterated the boundary between ruler and God. To understand how this worked, one must grasp Rome's moral architecture. Religion and law were one system. The emperor was the Pontifex Maximus, chief priest of the state religion, and his personal life, by extension, was a public covenant. The emperor's body symbolized Rome's stability. His family represented moral order. When he corrupted them, he corrupted the republic's entire moral grammar. By elevating Drusilla, Caligula created a divine family cult, a theology of blood that bypassed the Senate entirely. Every Roman oath, every prayer that now invoked Diva Drusilla Pantheia reinforced his supremacy. Her worship made his power not political, but cosmic. No senator could rival the brother of a goddess. Suetonius and Dio sneered at the incestuous rumor, but they understood its utility. Whether or not it was literal didn't matter. It functioned as a political weapon. The emperor's sin was his declaration of independence from human law. He was proving that his authority could extend even into the domain of the divine, where no senate, no court, and no tradition could reach him. This was the ultimate message of Rome's most horrifying sexual rituals. The acts themselves, real or exaggerated, were instruments, not indulgences. Through sex, Caligula legislated theology. Through incest, he defined sovereignty. To Rome's elites, this inversion was intolerable. For centuries, their legitimacy rested on tradition, on inherited virtue, ancestral piety, and the sanctity of the family. Caligula dismantled all three. The Roman domus, the household, had been both moral unit and political microcosm. Now, that structure was collapsing. In the imperial palace, where law itself was born, the traditional hierarchies inverted. Women became divine, men became silent, and the emperor, standing at the center, replaced the gods as the source of both shame and salvation. It was no longer possible to separate private vice from public governance. Every act of Caligula's lust was a lesson that Rome's order could be undone from its innermost core. Archaeological evidence supports this reinterpretation. Inscriptions from the provinces after 38 CE begin referring to the noumen of Caligula and Drusilla, their divine spirit, as a single force worshipped jointly. This wasn't mere flattery. It marked the beginning of what scholars later called the imperial cult, a state religion that would eventually crown later emperors as living gods. What later became a cornerstone of Roman political life began here, in the scandal of a brother and sister. The incest accusation, then, was less about perversion and more about propaganda. Caligula used it to terrify and seduce. His enemies used it to damn him for eternity. In both cases, the truth of the act mattered less than its function. The emperor's body had become a battlefield of meaning. Imagine the Senate's horror. The same man who sold their wives' bodies for humiliation now demanded they worship his sister's body for divinity. The parallels were deliberate. The brothel was an altar of degradation. The temple of Drusilla was an altar of apotheosis. Both taught the same lesson, that the emperor alone decided what was sacred and what was profane. The law followed. Caligula began issuing decrees in the name of both himself and his divine sister. Coins minted during this period bore the inscription Divus Augustus, Diva Drusilla, see Caesar. It was a trinity, the founder, the goddess, and the living god, a political theology carved in bronze. By embedding Drusilla into the machinery of the state, Caligula made his personal obsession untouchable. Every challenge to his divinity could be framed as sacrilege. He had transformed scandal into dogma. Even his enemies recognized the genius behind the blasphemy. The philosopher Seneca, who narrowly survived Caligula's reign, wrote later that fear can rule the body, but reverence rules the soul. Caligula sought both. His empire would not be held by swords, but by sacred terror. And yet, that terror was unstable. The more divine he became, the more fragile his humanity appeared. Whispers began again, not of incest this time, but of delusion. Courtiers said he no longer spoke to men, only to Jupiter. He would enter the temple, stand beside the statue of the god, and whisper, "You and I share the world." For Rome, it was unbearable. For Caligula, it was transcendence. His sister's death had given him the blueprint for a new Rome, one ruled not by law, but by ritual, not by reason, but by fear. The Senate had been humiliated, the gods rewritten, and the people enthralled. But what happens when a man who thinks himself divine begins to believe that everyone else is beneath him? That question would be answered in his next phase, the transformation of humiliation into entertainment. Because once religion had been conquered, there was only one frontier left to violate: the public stage. The next act would turn Rome's banquets into battlefields, and its laughter into confession. By the year 39 CE, Caligula no longer needed temples or laws to prove his divinity. His stage was the dinner table. His rituals were weddings. The emperor had discovered a new instrument of rule: humiliation performed in public, cloaked in laughter. The stories that follow are not tales of orgy, as popular legend later painted them. They were political rituals, crafted performances meant to dismantle what little dignity the Senate still possessed. One of the most infamous began at a wedding. The bride was Livia Orestilla, a noblewoman of ancient lineage. As her husband, Gaius Piso, recited his vows, Caligula interrupted the ceremony. According to Cassius Dio, the emperor leaned forward and quoted from Homer, "I too shall lie with your wife." The guests froze. Caligula stood, took the bride by the hand, and ordered the procession redirected to the Palatine Palace. The next morning, a public proclamation was issued. "By divine right, I have taken Orestilla as my wife." Within days, he divorced her and sent her into exile. To the Romans, it was madness. To Caligula, it was theatre. Each humiliation was structured like a play. There was an audience, the Senate, a protagonist, the emperor, and a victim whose pain would reinforce his supremacy. Another account tells of Lollia Paulina, a matron famed for her beauty. Caligula, having heard of her from a governor's report, summoned her to Rome, forced her husband to divorce her, married her himself, then cast her aside within a week. The message was clear: no man's household was beyond his reach. But nowhere did this ritual reach greater cruelty than at his banquets. Suetonius describes the dinners in painful detail: rooms draped in gold, slaves scattering petals, guests seated according to the emperor's whim. It would begin with charm. Caligula would flatter, joke, pour wine. Then, without warning, he would fix his gaze on a senator's wife. "Bring her to me," he would command. The woman would rise, trembling, and follow him to a private chamber. Moments later, Caligula would return to the table, smiling, sipping wine, and begin reviewing the encounter aloud. "She performs well," he would say, "though not as well as her father served in the Senate." The room would fill with nervous laughter. The husband would bow his head. No one moved. These were not orgies. They were executions of dignity. Each retelling, each forced chuckle, was a reminder that resistance was impossible. The Roman elite, once proud arbiters of morality, were reduced to participants in their own degradation. And yet, Caligula's cruelty carried a structure, a philosophy of control. The Roman Republic had ruled through honor. Caligula ruled through humiliation. In Rome, a man's virtues, his manly virtue, was tied to the control of his household. By violating that sanctum, Caligula shattered the foundation of masculine power. The husband who could not protect his wife could not protect his state. Modern psychology would call it symbolic castration. The emperor didn't need to kill senators. He stripped them of the thing they valued most: the illusion of authority. Every act of sexual cruelty was a public decree that the Senate's sovereignty was dead, and the emperor made sure these humiliations left witnesses: servants, guards, musicians, all present to observe and repeat the stories. Rumor became a weapon sharper than any blade. The Senate could not silence gossip about its own disgrace. In a city built on reputation, that was worse than death. Even Caligula's laughter had a function. When he ridiculed a man's wife in front of him, the sound wasn't joy, it was judgment. He turned laughter into a form of law. A senator could be executed with a smile. These spectacles reached their grotesque climax during a feast where, according to Dio, Caligula summoned the wives of his enemies, placed them on couches beside their husbands, and announced, "Tonight, the empire feasts on loyalty." He then inspected each woman, assigning them to partners of his choosing. The guests obeyed. To disobey would have been treason. This is what made Caligula's reign so terrifying. It wasn't random cruelty. It was systematized theater. Sex was no longer private. It was imperial ceremony. The emperor's pleasure was a mirror through which every Roman noble saw his own submission. For the common people, these stories spread like wildfire. They whispered that the emperor had turned morality itself inside out, that the palaces of Rome had become temples of blasphemy. But to others, it confirmed something worse. Caligula was redefining what it meant to be Roman. Virtue was now obedience. Purity was fear. Historians often compare Caligula's banquets to Nero's games decades later, but the distinction is crucial. Nero entertained, Caligula punished. His spectacles weren't diversions, they were declarations. Each humiliation served as a moral audit of his enemies. And yet, this new form of rule had a flaw. It relied on constant performance. The emperor had to keep shocking, keep humiliating, to maintain the illusion of omnipotence. If fear ever faded, rebellion would follow. That exhaustion began to show. Behind the laughter, Rome was seething. Senators played the part of obedient subjects by day, but in private, plotted revenge. Even the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's protectors, began whispering that the divine ruler had gone too far. Caligula had weaponized the most intimate human acts and turned them into instruments of domination. But in doing so, he had also destroyed every boundary that separated fear from hatred. And hatred, unlike lust, can't be controlled forever. The next chapter of his rule would prove that the laughter had limits, because the same man who made gods of his sisters and whores of senators' wives was about to elevate a horse to the highest office in Rome. And that, too, was no joke. By 40 CE, Caligula no longer needed to shout to be feared. His cruelty had evolved into something quieter, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. The Senate had been humiliated, the gods rewritten, the household desecrated. All that remained was to erase meaning itself. And for that, Caligula would use a horse. Its name was Incitatus, the swift one. It was not just a favorite animal, as the historians liked to mock, but a chosen symbol. According to Suetonius, the emperor built the stallion a marble stable, fed it oats mixed with gold dust, and appointed servants to attend to its every need. On feast days, senators were ordered to dine with the horse, dressed in official robes, while Caligula toasted the most loyal of all Romans. The spectacle culminated in his declaration that Incitatus would soon be made consul, the highest magistrate of Rome. The Senate gasped. Some thought it madness. Others realized it was something worse, a message. Because Caligula's reign had always been about inversion, turning the sacred into the obscene, law into theatre. By elevating a horse to the rank of Rome's highest official, he wasn't losing his mind. He was exposing theirs. Consider what the act truly meant. For centuries, the Roman elite believed in hierarchy, merit, and the sanctity of the Senate's authority. Offices were won through ancestry and achievement, or at least through bribes and alliances. Caligula cut through that illusion in a single stroke. By proposing a horse for consul, he declared that titles, laws, and legacies were meaningless. The emperor could make or unmake reality at will. The humiliation was layered. Senators who had once ruled provinces were now debating, in solemn tones, whether to confirm a horse's appointment. They bowed their heads, muttering about omens, pretending not to laugh, for laughter could be fatal. The Senate chamber had become a stage, and its rituals of governance had become parody. Some historians have suggested that Caligula's act was satire, a dark joke about the emptiness of Roman politics. But to those who lived through it, there was nothing funny. The horse was not a jest, it was an audit. The emperor was measuring how far he could push obedience before it broke. Every absurd decree that followed, the demand that statues of gods be replaced with his likeness, the order that soldiers collect seashells as spoils of war, belonged to the same logic. Caligula was testing the elasticity of submission. How much nonsense could a society tolerate before it rebelled? The deeper meaning of the horse lies in the transformation of power into absurdity. A sword rules by fear, but absurdity rules by exhaustion. When the emperor commands the impossible, and his subjects obey anyway, tyranny becomes self-sustaining. Rome had entered that stage. Senators now praised Caligula as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. They passed decrees in his name, calling his divine humor a mark of genius. Each proclamation was both flattery and confession. They had surrendered their dignity entirely. The brothel had broken their bodies, the banquets their pride, the horse shattered their reason. It was the final desecration of Rome's moral order. Where Augustus had built an empire on laws, Caligula rebuilt it on mockery. He didn't destroy the Senate, he forced it to destroy itself, word by word, applause by applause. To the common people, the emperor's madness had become a carnival. They laughed at his antics, whispered about his divinity, even cheered his new consul. But beneath the humor was horror. The Senate's collapse meant that no institution remained to shield them. If a horse could become consul, then any citizen could be condemned on a whim. When meaning dies, everything is permitted. The ancient writers saw this as the moment when Rome itself went insane. Cassius Dio described senators pretending to deliberate over the horse's qualifications. He has no vices, one supposedly said, unlike the rest of us. The irony was unbearable, but the fear was greater. For Caligula, the absurd had become sacred. The act of forcing rational men to applaud the irrational was itself the purest form of control. To rule through reason is to risk opposition. To rule through nonsense is to crush it completely. You cannot argue with insanity when it holds the power of life and death. And so, the emperor who had once sold the bodies of noble women now sold reason itself. He had turned Rome into his stage, and its citizens into unwilling actors. Every day became a performance of obedience. But even theatre needs an audience, and audiences grow restless. The laughter that once covered fear began to curdle into hatred. Behind closed doors, senators who had bowed for years began to whisper of daggers. The Praetorian Guard, once his shield, began to doubt their divine master, because beneath all the absurdity, they finally saw the truth. Caligula's reign was not the chaos of madness, it was the perfection of control. And no man, however divine he believes himself, can control fear forever. The emperor's next act would attempt something even more dangerous: to make fear holy. He had turned the Senate into clowns, women into instruments, and gods into servants. Now he would turn death itself into theatre. And for that, Rome would turn on him. Caligula's rule had become a living paradox. The man who laughed in the Senate and crowned a horse as consul was not deranged, he was deliberate. The absurdity was camouflage. Beneath it, he had built one of the most efficient systems of psychological control the ancient world had ever seen. Fear was not simply his tool, it was his infrastructure. Rome had known terror before. Tiberius had used it through secrecy and informants. Augustus had used it through law and precedent. But Caligula turned fear into spectacle, transforming punishment into performance. The difference was intent. His predecessors hid executions. Caligula staged them. He wanted Rome to see its own obedience. One of his first acts after declaring himself divine was to revive the treason trials. But he reshaped them into public rituals of submission. Senators accused of insulting the emperor's divinity were not quietly condemned. They were forced to praise him first. Prisoners were paraded through the forum in chains, their crimes read aloud as offenses against the divine order. Caligula would watch from a balcony, dressed in gold, and sometimes demand that the condemned recite their own sentences before the crowd. There were no appeals, only applause. But what terrified Rome most wasn't the executions. It was the random mercy. Caligula would sometimes spare a man after tormenting him for hours, declaring, "Let him live to remember." Others he killed for amusement, shouting, "So may all who doubt the gods perish." The city could not tell when the emperor was serious or joking, and that uncertainty became a form of control. Fear that can be predicted breeds rebellion. Fear that is arbitrary breeds obedience. He extended this logic to every corner of imperial life. Soldiers were ordered to perform mock campaigns, marching miles only to collect seashells as spoils of war. The act was ridiculous, but disobedience meant death. Merchants were taxed not for goods, but for attitudes of disloyalty. Even the weather was political. Once, during a thunderstorm, Caligula ran to the palace balcony, shouting at Jupiter to strike him dead if he was not a god. When lightning struck nearby, he laughed and ordered thanksgiving ceremonies. These acts were not insanity. They were pedagogy. Each absurd decree trained Rome to confuse obedience with faith. The emperor had become the only stable constant in a world he deliberately destabilized. His cult spread through the provinces with alarming speed. Cities competed to build temples in his honor. Statues of Jupiter were refashioned with Caligula's face. One surviving inscription from Pergamon reads, "To Gaius Caesar, the living God, who restores order through divine terror. It was both prayer and surrender. In private, senators were collapsing under the strain. The brothel had destroyed their pride, the banquets their masculinity. And now the treason courts their courage. There was no safe gesture. To weep was disloyalty. To smile was blasphemy. Some chose suicide simply to end the suspense. Caligula responded by confiscating their estates and punishing their families for the crime of despair. Even his guards were not immune. The Praetorians, once his protectors, found themselves both feared and watched. He rotated their commanders weekly, staged mock trials for laziness in worship, and occasionally forced soldiers to whip each other for his amusement. The message was constant: no one is safe, not even those who serve closest to the throne. This machinery of fear functioned because it mirrored Rome itself. The empire thrived on hierarchy, spectacle, and discipline. Caligula simply replaced the Republic's morality with his own cruelty. The Colosseum had not yet been built, but the principle was the same. The emperor commanded, the people watched, the victims performed. It was entertainment as enforcement. And in a society addicted to spectacle, the most horrifying punishment was not death, it was invisibility. Caligula understood this perfectly. He didn't just kill, he erased. When an enemy fell from favor, their names were chiseled off monuments, their portraits destroyed, their estates absorbed into the state. The Senate called it damnatio memoriae, the damnation of memory. Under Caligula, it became policy. But he inverted even this. Sometimes he erased a name not after death, but while the person still lived. They became ghosts in their own city, unacknowledged, unspoken, legally non-existent. This was terror perfected, not the fear of dying, but the fear of being unremembered. To the Roman people, the emperor's omnipotence began to feel supernatural. Rumors spread that he could hear blasphemy whispered miles away, that he punished thoughts. Some believed he had spies among the dead, ghosts of those he executed, now reporting from the underworld. Even the priests hesitated to pray without first seeking his permission. For the first time in Roman history, religion itself became surveillance. Caligula's reign had turned the sacred into an instrument of fear. He no longer ruled as man or god, but as both, a hybrid entity whose cruelty was framed as divine justice. And because Rome's laws were rooted in religion, his violence became self-justifying. Every humiliation, every execution, every perverse ritual was not tyranny. It was theology in action. But even perfection carries decay within it. A system of fear cannot stop itself. It must escalate or collapse. Caligula had already stripped the Senate of power, the gods of sanctity, and the people of certainty. There was only one frontier left, the truth itself. Because if you can control fear, and you can control memory, the final step is to control history. In the next act, Caligula would face his most dangerous adversary. Not a rival general or a scheming senator, but the storytellers who would decide how he would be remembered. The propaganda war had begun, and 2,000 years later, we are still living inside it. When Caligula's blood stained the marble corridors of the Palatine Palace in 41 CE, the blades of his assassins did more than end a reign. They began a story. The senators who struck him down didn't just kill an emperor, they wrote the script of his damnation. Within weeks, official decrees proclaimed that Gaius Caesar, Caligula, had been a tyrant, a madman, a monster in human form. His statues were torn down, his inscriptions erased, his name cursed. The Senate declared his rule null and void, as if to cleanse Rome of its own complicity. And yet, even in their vengeance, they continued to serve his system. The very act of rewriting him as insane was a continuation of his own politics of control. The campaign to destroy Caligula's memory was the first great experiment in imperial propaganda. The same Senate that had applauded his divine titles now claimed they had always resisted him. The same historians who dined under his rule began to describe themselves as victims of tyranny. It was the birth of a myth that would last 2 millennia. The chief architects of this narrative were Suetonius and Cassius Dio, men writing decades after Caligula's death, under emperors who owed their legitimacy to the Julio-Claudian dynasty's fall. Their works read like indictments more than histories. Caligula the pimp, Caligula the incestuous, Caligula the mad god. Their tone drips with moral outrage. But every accusation served a political purpose. Suetonius wrote under Hadrian, a ruler who sought to distance himself from divine absolutism. By portraying Caligula as the ultimate blasphemer, Suetonius flattered his own emperor as the rational savior who restored order. Cassius Dio, writing 2 centuries later, did the same for Severan Rome. To condemn Caligula was to reaffirm the empire's current stability. In other words, Caligula's insanity became Rome's morality play, a cautionary tale that legitimized every later emperor who claimed to have restored sanity. Yet, when we peel back the rhetoric, the evidence collapses into contradiction. None of the contemporary records, coins, inscriptions, or decrees from his own reign describe a lunatic. They reveal a man obsessed with procedure, with ceremonial precision, with the language of law. Even his most obscene acts were recorded through bureaucratic channels. Madness doesn't draft legislation, paranoia doesn't balance treasuries. But propaganda doesn't need coherence, it needs a villain. And Caligula, already hated by the Senate, was perfect for the role. His destruction became a template. Future rulers learned that memory could be managed as effectively as armies. Damn the enemy not with silence, but with story. Define their crimes so vividly that posterity never doubts. Rome would repeat this pattern again and again. Against Nero, against Domitian, against anyone who ruled too absolutely. But in the case of Caligula, the erasure was so total that modern historians are left piecing together a ghost. Archaeology offers fragments, temples erected in his honor during his lifetime, administrative reforms that stabilized tax systems, letters that hint at pragmatic governance. None of these fit the caricature of the raving madman. The dissonance itself exposes the mechanism of propaganda. Even his nickname, Caligula, Little Boots, was part of the distortion. It began as a term of affection when he was a child among his father's soldiers, but the historians weaponized it, turning the image of the boy mascot into a symbol of mockery. The infantilization served a rhetorical purpose. A child playing emperor, a god in baby shoes. The portraits stuck. This manipulation of image over evidence is why Caligula endures, not as a man, but as a mirror. Each age reinterprets him according to its fears. The Victorians saw sexual deviance. Modern writers see political theatre. The truth, buried beneath centuries of moral storytelling, may be simpler and darker. Caligula understood that power is performance, and the Senate merely perfected his lesson after his death. When we read Suetonius describing the brothel of the palace, or Dio retelling the horse consul, we are not hearing eyewitnesses. We are hearing Rome's victors justify themselves. Their outrage is theatre, their disgust strategy. They turned history into moral propaganda to sanitize their own cowardice. And the irony is almost poetic. In their effort to erase Caligula, they ensured his immortality. His legend survived precisely because it was scandalous. Every retelling, every accusation, every new biography, each one replays the same imperial instinct to control the narrative. 2,000 years later, the propaganda still works. Caligula's name remains shorthand for madness and excess, while the senators who built the myth vanish into anonymity. We can recite every rumor of his depravity, but not the names of those who stabbed him. That imbalance is the true legacy of Rome's political storytelling, because propaganda doesn't just shape memory, it decides who is remembered at all. Caligula mastered the theatre of humiliation. His enemies mastered the theatre of history. The difference is only one of stage lighting. Both understood that truth was irrelevant when spectacle ruled perception. But the question remains, if history itself can be weaponized, can tyranny ever truly die? Or does it merely change costume, from marble statues and scrolls to screens and feeds? In the next part, we turn to the final act, the boy behind the monster, and the empire that created him. Because to understand Caligula's cruelty, we must return to where it was born, an island, a poison, and a child who learned that survival required smiling at his parents' killers. Before the monster, there was a boy, and before the boy, there was a family, devoured by Rome itself. Gaius Julius Caesar. Germanicus, later known as Caligula, was born into the closest thing Rome had to royalty. His father, Germanicus, was beloved by the people, the model general of the early empire. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, was the granddaughter of Augustus himself. To the Senate, they represented virtue and legacy. To Emperor Tiberius, they represented a threat. When Germanicus died suddenly in Syria in 19 CE, likely poisoned, Agrippina accused the emperor's allies of murder. It was the kind of accusation one did not survive. Over the next decade, the imperial family was dismantled piece by piece. Agrippina was exiled to a barren island. Her sons Nero and Drusus imprisoned and starved. Their bodies were never retrieved. Only one child was spared, Gaius. He was taken to live with Tiberius on the island of Capri, an isolated fortress of marble, debauchery, and paranoia. The boy was 8 years old. To the world, he was Caligula, Little Boots, the adorable mascot of his father's legions. To Tiberius, he was a living hostage. Capri was not a place of childhood, it was a laboratory of fear. According to the ancient sources, Tiberius had retreated there in his final years, surrounded by astrologers, spies, and exiles forced to amuse him. Executions took place in view of the sea. Prisoners were thrown from cliffs into the water below. Caligula watched and learned. He learned that power was never gentle and that survival depended on silence. Suetonius wrote that the old emperor used to say, "I am nursing a viper in Rome's bosom." But Tiberius didn't kill him. Perhaps he saw something familiar in the boy, an instinct for deception, a smile that masked calculation. Caligula flattered his captor, studied him, and endured. For 7 years, he learned how to live under a man who killed without emotion and rewarded obedience without mercy. By the time Tiberius died in 37 CE, Caligula was 24 and utterly remade. He had seen how the Senate groveled before fear, how courtiers praised their own executioners. He had learned the one truth that would define his reign, that Rome was not governed by virtue, but by spectacle. When he first ascended to the throne, the transformation seemed miraculous. The young emperor declared an amnesty for prisoners, recalled exiles, restored public games, and distributed money to the people. Crowds hailed him as the son of Germanicus, the return of Rome's lost innocence. The Senate, desperate for stability, voted him divine honors. But the mask began to slip. The records show that a few months into his reign, Caligula suffered a sudden illness. Some say fever, others poison, perhaps even epilepsy. He recovered, but those close to him said he was no longer the same. He spoke of visions, of hearing his father's voice calling him from the underworld. He began demanding temples built to his name, priests appointed to his service. The young idealist had become something else entirely. A man determined not just to rule Rome, but to own it. Yet his transformation was not insanity. It was the logic of trauma turned inside out. The child who once survived Tiberius's cruelty by pretending affection now wielded that same cruelty as a language of control. The silence he had once been forced to keep became the silence he demanded from others. Every humiliation he inflicted later, the brothel, the banquets, the horse, was an echo of Capri, a recreation of the same theatre of fear that had shaped him. Tiberius had made men kneel by terror. Caligula would make them kneel by mockery. Where Tiberius hid his brutality in secrecy, Caligula performed it in daylight. It was the same machine, painted in brighter colors. And perhaps that's why his cruelty felt so personal. Because for Caligula, it was personal. He had watched his family destroyed by men who smiled while doing it, the same senators who later toasted his rise to power. He remembered their faces, the laughter, the hypocrisy, the prayers to the gods of Rome that justified every act of betrayal. When he finally stood above them as emperor, he did not see citizens. He saw ghosts of the people who had killed his mother and brothers. His rule was not governance. It was revenge disguised as divinity. Even his infamous self-deification can be read through that lens. To a man who had seen his family murdered by human law, godhood was not arrogance, it was self-defense. If men could not kill gods, then becoming one was the only form of survival left. This is the part history rarely tells, the psychological crucible that created the monster it condemns. Caligula was not born evil. He was taught evil by the same empire that later claimed to purge it. His cruelty was a mirror turned back on Rome, reflecting its own hunger for domination. When he finally fell to the blades of his guards, it was not the destruction of tyranny, it was its reproduction. Each man who stabbed him believed he was saving Rome. In truth, they were preserving it. Because Rome did not kill what it hated in Caligula, it killed what it feared to see in itself. And yet, even in death, he remained undefeated in one sense. He had proven that power could outlive reason, that control required only belief, and that the line between emperor and god was not moral, it was performative. In the next part, the jury of history returns. The verdict that would shape 2,000 years of memory, and the question that still divides us today: was Caligula Rome's greatest pervert or its most dangerous philosopher of power? When the daggers were pulled from Caligula's body, the blood had barely cooled before the stories began. The assassins claimed they had liberated Rome from a beast. The Senate declared the emperor's memory cursed, his laws void, his name unspeakable. The city exhaled, but the silence that followed was uneasy. Because behind the relief lay a deeper question no one dared to ask aloud. Had Caligula truly been a mad tyrant? Or had he simply revealed the madness Rome preferred not to see? The historical record splits in two. The first version, the one most people know, was written by his enemies. It portrays a monster of limitless lust and cruelty, a man who slept with his sisters, mocked the gods, murdered for sport, and declared himself divine. But the second version, buried beneath propaganda and marble dust, suggests something far more complex. It shows a ruler who understood power with surgical precision, who used obscenity and terror not as indulgence but as method. Let us weigh the evidence. The palace brothel, recorded by Suetonius, contains bureaucratic details no myth would bother to invent. Ledgers, taxes, official clerks. That precision implies not fantasy, but administration. The intent was never wealth, but degradation. A systematic dismantling of senatorial pride. That's not madness. It's governance through humiliation. The incest, too, served purpose. In Rome, the emperor's divinity depended on separation from ordinary mortals. By elevating Drusilla to goddess and himself as her divine consort, Caligula imported the Hellenistic model of kingship, the same ideology that later emperors, including Domitian and Diocletian, would revive. What was heresy in 38 CE became orthodoxy a century later. Even the horse incitatus, that absurd emblem of lunacy, carries political logic. By threatening to make the animal consul, Caligula declared the Senate irrelevant, a living demonstration that titles and traditions meant nothing without his will. The gesture was cruel, yes, but not insane. It was brutally rational. What, then, was Caligula guilty of? Perhaps only this. He stripped Rome of its illusions. The empire worshipped hierarchy, but pretended it was virtue. It called its conquests civilization, its slavery law, and its superstition religion. Caligula, raised in that hypocrisy, merely exaggerated it until it became visible. His reign was Rome unmasked, raw, performative, obscene. Suetonius called him a monster who confused pleasure with policy. But maybe Caligula never confused them at all. Maybe he understood that in Rome, policy was pleasure, the thrill of domination, the ecstasy of control. He turned that principle inward, forcing the Senate and the people to taste the empire's own violence. This is why his legacy endures. He was not the disease, but the diagnosis. The senators who killed him didn't destroy his system. They absorbed it. The empire that followed would perfect his methods. The deification of rulers, the ritual humiliation of enemies, the performance of virtue to justify cruelty. The Colosseum, completed decades later, was Caligula's logic in stone. A theatre where law and entertainment fused, where death became policy and spectacle became governance. To call him mad is to absolve Rome, but to call him rational is to indict it. Modern historians still debate the line between myth and reality, between propaganda and pathology. But the answer may lie not in documents, but in the pattern. Every empire produces its Caligula, a ruler who exposes the violence hidden beneath civility. And every society that births such a figure must decide whether to confront its reflection or destroy it. When Caligula stood before the Senate and whispered, "I am God," he wasn't just defying religion. He was telling the truth about Rome's hierarchy. The emperor was divine, not by miracle, but by collective submission. His godhood was manufactured by fear, sustained by complicity, and worshipped through silence. That is why the myth survives. Because it wasn't just about him. It was about us. Was Caligula a monster? Absolutely. But the question history avoids is more disturbing. If his empire had made him that way, what does that make the rest of Rome? His body rotted, his name cursed, but his philosophy remained. The idea that the ultimate form of power is not to be loved or feared, but to define reality itself. And that idea, like Rome, never truly died. In the next and final part, we return to the ledger, the silence of stone, the bones beneath the palaces, and the haunting question that outlived the empire itself. Because the trial of Caligula never really ended, it only changed stage. History insists that Caligula died screaming, stabbed 30 times by his own guards, as his wife and daughter were cut down beside him. His killers dragged his body through the palace halls and dumped it into a shallow grave, as if burying a disease. Yet, for 2,000 years, Rome has never stopped talking about him. His story survived the empire, the church, even time itself. Because the trial of Caligula never ended. It simply moved to new courts, books, theatres, screens, and our own imaginations. The evidence remains scattered like bones across centuries. Coins bearing his face, temples dedicated to his divine sister, fragments of marble inscriptions praising his mercy. These are not the relics of a lunatic. They're the debris of a system that made divinity administrative. His world was one where gods were paperwork and cruelty was procedure. In that sense, Caligula didn't invent tyranny. He mechanized it. And that's what makes him terrifyingly modern. Every empire that followed Rome learned from him, whether it admits it or not. The power to humiliate in public, to legislate reality, to turn belief itself into obedience. These are the technologies of rule that outlive kings. Caligula's Rome wasn't destroyed, it was digitized. The same formula repeats across history. Deify the ruler, control the narrative, punish disbelief as treason. And when the stories grow unbearable, rewrite them as madness. Suetonius and Dio did it first. Modern media does it still. The names change, the costumes evolve, but the performance remains identical. Moral outrage, masking complicity. Rome's historians weren't lying when they called Caligula a monster. They were merely disguising their own reflection. Even his supposed sexual rituals, the brothel, the banquets, the horse, they were all performances about truth itself. Caligula turned hypocrisy into policy. He forced Rome to act out its own depravity, to admit that every temple, every Senate decree, every execution was built on the same principle, that power is sacred when it belongs to us, and blasphemy when it belongs to someone else. And that is why his legend persists, not as warning, but as mirror. We watch him through the lens of disgust, yet we recreate him in every age, in tyrants who confuse obedience for love, in governments that weaponize humiliation, in societies that worship spectacle over truth. Caligula is not just Rome's ghost, he is civilization's recurring fever. The bones beneath the Palatine still whisper the same ledger he once wrote in flesh. Control the body, and you control the soul. Control the spectacle, and you control the truth. Control the story, and you never die. His assassins failed to erase him. They killed the man, but not the system. The next emperors, Claudius, Nero, Domitian, perfected his methods, just with better lighting. And when those two fell, the empire simply changed name and language, moving from marble to parchment to screen. We call him insane because it's easier than admitting he was right. Because the moment we recognize his method, the merging of cruelty and theater, politics and worship, we lose the comfort of distance. We see that his empire never really collapsed. It evolved into ours. Caligula understood something timeless. People will endure any humiliation if they believe it's part of a sacred performance. Whether in an amphitheater or an algorithm, the audience still applauds. So when we look back at the emperor who burned dignity for entertainment, who blurred sin and policy, we are not studying ancient history. We are standing in front of a mirror. The question was never, was Caligula mad? It was always, what kind of world creates a man like that and keeps needing him? Because when the ledger closes and the lights go out, one truth remains unchanged across 2 millennia. Power never disappears. It only changes costume.